What happens when a suburban tyrant mistakes a legend for a local eyesore? Brenda Vance thought she could use her HOA power to bully an old rancher off his land to build her son's luxury golf course. She showed up with a fire axe, a stack of fraudulent fines, and a 911 call intended to ruin a man's life. But she made one fatal mistake. She forgot to check whose jurisdiction she was standing in. Watch as this cinematic confrontation turns from public humiliation to a total power reversal, because you should never pick a fight with a man whose badge outshines your ego. The morning sun over the Thorn Ranch didn't rise so much as it ignited, casting long amber fingers across 600 acres of untouched Montana gold. For Elias Thorn, the air smelled of damp earth and alfalfa, a scent that had anchored his family to this soil for 4 generations. But as he leaned against the weathered split-rail fence, the tranquility was punctured by the rhythmic, aggressive clack-clack-clack of high heels hitting the packed dirt of his driveway. Brenda Vance did not walk. She marched, clad in a sharp, lavender-hued business suit that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of lowing cattle and hay barns. She held a thick manila folder like a shield. She was the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, a title she wore with the lethal gravity of a Supreme Court justice. Behind her, the suburban sprawl she championed, rows of identical beige McMansions, loomed on the ridgeline like a rising tide ready to drown the valley. "Mr. Thorn," Brenda called out, her voice thin and metallic in the open air. She didn't wait for a greeting. She stopped 5 feet away, the dust settling on her polished pumps. "I assume you received the certified letters, the ones regarding the unmanaged livestock and the structural blight of that eyesore?" She gestured vaguely toward the 1920s timber barn behind him. Elias didn't move. He kept his back to the fence, his calloused hands tucked into the pockets of his stained canvas jacket. He looked every bit the tired rancher Brenda assumed him to be, gray-bearded, dusty, and past his prime. "The letters make good kindling, Brenda, but this land isn't in your jurisdiction. The Thorn Ranch was here 50 years before you broke ground on your first cul-de-sac." Brenda's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine loathing crossing her face. To her, Elias wasn't just a neighbor, he was a glitch in her perfect manicured world. "The annex agreement signed 3 months ago says otherwise. We've rezoned the perimeter. Your heritage is now a violation of Section 4, Paragraph B, visual nuisance and odor control." She stepped closer, the smell of her expensive, cloying perfume battling the natural scent of the ranch. She leaned in, dropping the professional facade for a moment. "My son's firm is breaking ground on the Thorn Heights golf course in 60 days, Elias. This land is wasted on you. You're an old man living in the dirt, clutching a ghost. Why fight the inevitable? Take the buyout, or these fines will simply eat the equity until there's nothing left to bury you in." She began to pace the length of the fence, pulling papers from her folder and slopping them against the wood. Each one was a formal notice, thousands of dollars in selective enforcement penalties. She pointed out the illegal height of his grass, the unauthorized color of his fence, and the public health risk of his small herd. It was a calculated psychological siege. 2 other members of the HOA board, a pair of golf shirts who looked perpetually uncomfortable, stood by the road, watching. Brenda turned toward them, raising her voice so they and the world could hear. "You see this? This is what happens when progress is halted by stubbornness. It's pathetic, really. A man living in squalor because he can't let go of a few cows." The humiliation was intentional. She wanted him to feel small, to feel the weight of a community turning against him. She spoke to him as if he were a slow-witted child, mocking the grease under his nails and the way his barn leaned slightly to the west. Elias felt the familiar heat of anger rising in his chest, but he suppressed it. He thought of the badge sitting in his kitchen drawer and the decades of service he had given to this county. He could have ended this a month ago with a single call, but he wanted to see how far Brenda would go. He wanted to see the full extent of the rot in her soul. "I'm not leaving, Brenda," Elias said quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon where his cattle grazed in peace. "And your son isn't putting a sand trap on my father's grave." Brenda's face turned a mottled shade of red. She shoved the remaining papers into his chest. "We'll see about that. If you won't listen to reason, you'll listen to the law. I'm going to ensure that by the time I'm done, you won't even be able to afford the gas to drive off this property." As she turned to stomp back toward her luxury SUV, Elias remained motionless. The silence of the ranch returned, but it was brittle now, charged with the electricity of a coming storm. He knew this was only the beginning. Brenda Vance didn't just want the land, she wanted to break him. The week that followed Brenda's visit felt like the heavy, breathless pause before a summer thunderstorm. Elias spent his mornings in the barn, the rhythmic rasp of a scythe against a scythe the only sound in the vast stillness. He watched from the shadows of the timber frame as Brenda's SUV patrolled the perimeter of his property like a shark circling a reef. She wasn't just sending letters anymore, she was recording him, her long manicured finger pointing out infractions to various contractors she brought along to survey his posters as if they already owned them. On Tuesday, the water was cut off. On Wednesday, a condemned sign was hammered into the gatepost by a man who refused to look Elias in the eye. By Friday, the psychological warfare reached a fever pitch. Elias was at the fence line, checking a loose post, when the roar of a high-end engine tore through the afternoon. Brenda's silver Mercedes screeched to a halt, kicking up a violent plume of dust that coated Elias's work jacket in a fine gray powder. When she stepped out, the lavender suit was gone, replaced by a sharp chocolate-colored professional blazer and skirt, her hair pulled back into a ponytail so tight it seems to pull her eyes into a permanent snarl. "I warned you, Elias," she screamed over the idling engine. "The board has voted. This is an emergency seizure for public safety. You're harboring a nuisance, and you're doing it with malice." She marched to her trunk and popped it open. Elias watched, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He expected more papers, perhaps another fraudulent injunction. Instead, Brenda reached into the cargo area and pulled out a heavy, red-handled fire axe. The steel head caught the sun, glinting with a terrifying, predatory light. "What are you doing, Brenda?" Elias asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I'm taking back this neighborhood," she shrieked. Her face was no longer that of a poised executive. It was a mask of unhinged entitlement. "You think you can sit here and rot while my son's future is on hold? You think these old boards are more important than progress?" She lunged toward the main gate, the heavy axe swinging clumsily in her hands. She began to hack at the thick wooden crossmember of the gate, the thwack of steel hitting cedar echoing like a gunshot across the valley. She was breathing hard, her expensive heels sinking into the soft mud of the driveway. "I'm calling it in," she yelled, fumbling for her phone with one hand while keeping the axe gripped in the other. "I'm telling them you're attacking me. I'm telling them you've gone senile and violent. They'll take you away in a straitjacket, and by the time you're drugged up in a ward, the bulldozers will be halfway through your kitchen." She punched 3 digits into her phone. Elias stood perfectly still, leaning his hip against the fence, his eyes tracking the frantic movement of the axe. 911? Yes, I need an immediate tactical response at the Thorn Ranch. There is a dangerous, armed vagrant threatening a public official. He's brandishing a weapon. I'm in fear for my life. She was sobbing now, a practiced theatrical weep that would have been convincing to anyone who couldn't see the predatory gleam in her eyes. "Please, send everyone. He's losing his mind." She hung up and looked at Elias, a triumphant, jagged smile breaking through her fake tears. "They're coming, Elias, and they don't play nice with crazy old hermits." Elias didn't move to stop her. He didn't even stand up straight. He simply adjusted his weight, the rough wood of the fence post biting into his shoulder. He felt a profound sense of grief, not for the gate she was scarring, but for the world she represented. A world where power was a blunt instrument used to crush anything that didn't fit into a blueprint. The first siren appeared as a faint wail on the wind, growing into a deafening scream as it bounced off the canyon walls. 2 black and white cruisers tore around the bend, their blue and red lights turning the green pastures into a chaotic strobe of color. They didn't slow down until they were yards away, skidding to a halt in a synchronized spray of gravel. 5 officers spilled out of the doors, their movements disciplined and sharp. They formed a loose semicircle, hands hovering near their holsters, their eyes scanning the scene. They saw the woman in the expensive suit holding a fire axe. They saw the vagrant leaning casually against the fence. Brenda dropped the axe into the dirt, a calculated move to look like the victim, and ran toward the lead car, her hands clawing at the air. "Thank God! Arrest him! He tried to kill me! He's trespassing on HOA property, and he's armed!" The officers didn't move toward Elias. They stood like statues, their gazes fixed on the man at the fence. The air grew cold, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engines and Brenda's frantic, ragged breathing. Elias finally looked up, his eyes meeting the lead officers. "Afternoon, boys," he said softly. "Took you long enough." The gravel road was a stage, and Brenda Vance was determined to win an Oscar for her performance. She stood between the idling cruisers and the fence line, her chest heaving, her finger pointed at Elias with a theatrical tremor that vibrated through the quiet afternoon. "What are you waiting for?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a manufactured hysteria that vibrated through the quiet afternoon. "I am the president of the Willow Creek HOA. I have a standing injunction against this man. He just threatened me with that, she gestured wildly at the red-handled fire axe lying in the dirt, the very one she had been swinging moments ago. "He's a squatter. He's a danger to the community. Look at him. He's clearly unstable." Elias didn't look unstable. He looked like a man watching a movie he had already seen a dozen times. He remained leaning against the silvered wood of the fence post, his legs crossed at the ankles. His weathered face was a map of the territory, deep lines carved by sun, wind, and a heavy burden of keeping the peace. He watched Brenda's son, Marcus, pull up in a pristine white pickup truck, jumping out to join her mother. "Is there a problem here, officers?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with the unearned confidence of a man who had spent his life behind a desk. "My mother called for an extraction. This land is under development. We have the permits. This man needs to be removed immediately for trespassing." Brenda leaned into the lead officer, a young sergeant named Miller. "He's probably got a gun in that barn, Sergeant. You need to use force. Subdue him before he hurts someone else. I'll make sure the commissioner hears about your bravery today." The officers didn't look at Brenda. They didn't look at Marcus. They looked at Elias and waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The cattle in the distance lowed, a mournful sound that seemed to mock Brenda's frantic energy. The suspense was a physical weight, a coiled spring ready to snap. Brenda, sensing a shift in the atmosphere she couldn't quite explain, took a step back, her heels clicking sharply. "Well," demanded she, her voice rising to a frantic pitch, "do your jobs!" Elias sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He pushed off the fence, standing to his full height. Despite his dusty boots and the fraying cuffs of his canvas jacket, there was an unmistakable shift in the air. The officers didn't reach for their tasers. They didn't even shift their weight. Instead, they stood straighter, their chins tucking in a subconscious show of respect. Slowly, Elias reached into his interior pocket. Brenda gasped, flinching behind her son. "He's going for a weapon! Shoot! Shoot him!" Elias didn't pull a gun. He pulled a worn leather wallet. With a flick of his thumb, he flipped it open. The afternoon sun caught the polished gold of a 7-point star, the metal gleaming with a terrifying authority that made the air feel suddenly very thin. "Sergeant Miller?" Elias said, his voice no longer a rumble, but a blade. "Yes, Sheriff Thorne?" Miller replied, his voice echoing with a crisp, military precision. Brenda's mouth fell open, a silent, ugly O. The axe in the birt seemed to glow a brighter shade of red. Marcus took a step back, his face draining of color until he looked as white as his truck. "I believe we have a few issues here," Elias continued, stepping toward the road. The officers stepped aside, opening the circle to let him through. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his eyes never leaving Brenda's.
"I've seen a lot of bullies come through this valley," Brenda said. "Most of them wear suits. Most of them think that because they have a title and a bank account, the law is something they can edit like a newsletter." He looked at the officers. "Sergeant, please secure the weapon. And Marcus, don't move. I want to talk to you about those permits you've been forging at the county clerk's office. I've had a deputy sitting in your trash for 3 weeks. We know about the embezzlement. We know where the HOA fees are going."
The public reckoning was no longer a threat. It was a landslide. The cinematic power of the moment, the lawman in the dust, the corrupt in their finery, clashed in the middle of the road. Brenda looked around at the 5 officers, her heroes, and realized they weren't there to rescue her. They were his honor guard. "Handcuff her, Sergeant," Elias commanded. She wanted a tactical response. "Let's make sure she gets the full experience." The metallic clack hiss of handcuffs ratcheting shut was the only sound in the vast open valley. It was a cold, clinical noise that sliced through Brenda's gasping protests. Sergeant Miller didn't hesitate. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had taken orders from Elias Thorne for a decade. Brenda's arms were wrenched behind her lavender blazer, her chest pressed against the hood of the patrol car she had summoned as her personal cavalry. "You can't do this," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking into a high-pitched plea. He took a step toward his mother, but 2 officers immediately stepped into his path, their expressions as immovable as granite. "This is a misunderstanding. We're taxpayers. We're the ones improving this community." Elias turned his gaze to Marcus, and the younger man froze. It wasn't an act of anger. It was a look of profound, weary disappointment. "You aren't improving anything, Marcus. You're stripping the soul out of this valley to build a monument to your own greed, and you're doing it with money you stole from your neighbors." Elias reached into the manila folder Brenda had dropped. He pulled out one of the fines, a $3,000 penalty for offense color. He let the paper slip from his fingers. The wind caught it, tumbling across the dirt toward the axe. "I spent 30 years in a uniform, making sure people felt safe in their homes. I didn't think I'd have to defend my own home from people like you." The emotional weight of the last 6 months seemed to settle on Elias's shoulders all at once. The sleepless nights spent reviewing HOA bylaws, the quiet trauma of being followed while he checked his mail, and the stinging humiliation of being called trash on the land where he had buried his father. He looked at the barn, the silvered timber that Brenda had called an eyesore. To him, every knot in that wood was a memory of a life lived with integrity. "Sheriff, we found the records in the trunk," one of the officers called out, holding up a ledger and a laptop. "It's all here. The diverted HOA funds, the kickbox from the construction firm. It's a paper trail a mile long." Brenda's face, usually so composed and sharp, had completely collapsed. The Karen of Willow Creek was gone, replaced by a woman whose narrow world had just shattered. She looked at the 5 officers, then at the ranch, and finally at Elias. For the first time, she saw him, not as a hurdle to be jumped, but as the mountain she had been foolish enough to try and move. "Please," she whispered, her forehead resting against the cold metal of the cruiser. "My reputation, my son." "Your reputation was built on fear, Brenda, and fear is a brittle foundation. It breaks the moment someone stands up to it." He signaled to Sergeant Miller. "Take them down to the station. Process them. I want every fraudulent fine and every illegal lien they've placed on the residents of Willow Creek documented. We are going to dismantle that HOA board by the morning." As the cruisers began to pull away, their tires crunching slowly over the gravel, the flashing lights faded into the late afternoon glow. Marcus was shoved into the second car, his head ducked in shame, while Brenda sat in the back of the first, staring blankly out the window at the ranch she would never own. The dust settled. The silence returned, deeper and more secret than before. Elias stood alone at the gate. He picked up the red-handled fire axe from the dirt. He felt the weight of it, a tool meant to save lives, twisted into a weapon of entitlement. He walked to his barn and set the axe on a workbench, where it would stay as a reminder. He walked back out to the fence and leaned against the wood, watching the sunset. The sky was a bruised purple and gold, mirroring the colors of the suit Brenda had worn when she arrived to destroy him. In the distance, his cattle began to move toward the barn for the night, their bells chiming softly.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. He looked at the gold star, then at the land. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy. The Willow Creek shadow had retreated. He was just a man on his ranch, a steward of the earth, finally granted the peace he had earned. Elias closed his eyes, took a deep breath of the scent of alfalfa and freedom, and walked toward his home. Justice didn't just knock on Brenda's door, it tore the hinges off. What began as a ruthless land grab ended with the Queen of Willow Creek in handcuffs, watching her empire crumble against the very fence she tried to destroy. Elias Thomas didn't need to shout to win, he just needed to show his star. It serves as a powerful reminder. Never mistake a man's silence for weakness, and never underestimate the roots of a legacy. What would you do if an HOA tried to seize your home? Let us know in the comments. Like if you enjoyed this reckoning and subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice.